How does the medium find that out just from talking on the phone, right?
I don't know. Mediums are... I always go skeptical when people are telling me about mediums personally, because it just sounds so bonkers to me. Yeah. But then they come up with some stuff that's like, how do you get there? Like, how do you figure that out? So my mind's always blown. So I don't know.
I will say the consistency in this case, and the consistency with a lot of the cases that we deal with, is a lot of these places, and I'm not saying anything bad about mediums, but whenever these people bring mediums into the situation,
it gets worse.
It amplifies it 10 times worse.
So here's the crazy part about that, though, and we're like, you get real skeptical about these mediums. So as Dave was saying, they called the mother. The mother said she knew the previous people. So a few days later, she calls her son back, and she's like, well, I talked to the people that used to live there, and they said, well, the woman that I know had a little daughter, and she would be playing in her room, and when we'd come home, sometimes her toys would be moved, and we don't know who did it. And then she said her daughter had an imaginary friend in the house. We didn't think much of it. And he's like, what was the name? What was the imaginary friend's name? And she's like, oh, she said it was Sallie. Which is crazy, right? Exactly. Like,
so everything comes around kind of full circle. Mm-hmm. So this is where the story really kind of picks up. They actually called, so after they found out that Barbara O'Connor's was right, they called her up and were like, this is crazy. They told her about Tony getting scratched in the back, and they're like, we think that this entity might be dangerous. It's important to know.
AKA demonic.
Exactly. So now, oddly enough, Debra has a strange attachment to this ghost. She feels almost like a mothering kind of role to this ghost.
Which is the opposite of what Tony was feeling at the time. So Tony's getting attacked, right? He's getting scratched. And meanwhile, his wife is taking on like the motherly role, where she's like, "Oh, we have to welcome this." I mean, she's also listening to the advice from the medium, where she's like, "You got to take this spirit in and be nice to her, and, you know, like treat her like you would treat a child." So she's buying gifts for it. She's setting a place for it at the table. She's taking all these precautions to make sure that this spirit feels welcome inside the house.
Well, let's talk about the gift that she bought for Sallie.
So Debra comes home with a gift wrap box. Right, this is a little bit before Christmas time, and Tony's like, "What's with the box?" And she's like, "Oh, it's just a little gift that I bought for Sallie because she's being so good lately." And Tony's like, "What is going on? What are you doing? This is crazy." She's like, blows him off. So she goes upstairs and she puts the wrapped gift in the middle of the room and leaves the room. And Tony's following her down the hallway like, "This is nuts. Don't you think this is?" And now he stops because they both hear something dragging across the bedroom floor. So they're like, uh-oh. So they turn around, they go back in. The box had been moved from the middle of the floor over to the side, still unwrapped, or still completely wrapped, unopened. But the doll that Debra bought is in the middle of the crib with the box still wrapped. So they're like, oh my God, what is going on?
How the hell does that happen?
I don't know. I don't know.
It's crazy, man. Like everything that you hear about this house, and it just escalates and it escalates and it escalates, and you're like, you don't want to believe it, but then you hear about other people's stories again that happen afterwards, and everything that happens to the Pickmans is wild. And another thing that they discovered is that 40 years that the Finneys didn't live there, and between the Pickmans moving in, is what they ended up coming up, like it's attacking Tony, is because he's the first male that's lived in the house since the Finneys lived there.
Yeah, for the most part, it was women and mother-daughters that were moving in. Right. So there was no men in the house. So and if you think back to, if you buy into the story that Sallie was the little girl who was killed by the doctor, accidentally or not, the last thing she's looking at is this man torturing her to death for whatever reason, or that's what's in her mind, right? Yeah. And then all of a sudden, 40 years later, boom, or however many years later, now there's a man in the house again, so she's going to be angry towards him. The other thing we should mention about Tony is Tony was a very, very religious person, grew up Catholic, did not believe in any of this, didn't want anything to do with the paranormal. It just wasn't in his upbringing, so he was super against it. The wife, Debra, she was a little more into it. She always was kind of curious as a kid, just always wanted to have some kind of connection with the afterlife or the paranormal, and so she was more open to it, which was obviously why she was more welcoming towards Sallie. Meanwhile, he's very standoffish, and all these bad things are happening to him. He's like, how the hell did I get in this situation, you know?
So as Debra became more and more obsessed with Sallie, Tony started to become more and more distressed. He began hearing disembodied voices. He'd wake up in the middle of the night to feeling like sharp little teeth are biting his toes. He'd kick the covers off to reveal nothing biting him, but on more than one occasion, there would be little bite marks that were too small to be an adult and too big to be like a rodent or a cat or something.
There were also in places that like he couldn't have inflicted himself. Like he was saying, like one was like right on the back of his leg.
Bite your own toes.
I've tried.
I'd love to see you try.